Today we're going to talk about personality. Compared to those other topics we talked about for the previous weeks, most of those topics, for example, like memory, perception, language, things like those, basically we didn't talk too much about individual difference. The only time we talked about individual difference was intelligence. Intelligence, when we were talking about intelligence, we were concerned about individual difference. But for intelligence, it is related to the individual difference in their cognitive function. We didn't talk about the individual differences in emotion, motivation, or interpersonal relationship, things like that. And we are going to talk about them today. So in our everyday life, I suppose most of you have the experiences of talking with your friends about, okay, sometimes you're just gossiping about other people. Okay? Maybe you will say things like, he's kind, my colleagues are kind, my boss is kind, or she's generous, or he's ambitious, or he's something, or she's something. These kind of conversation, they happen a lot in our everyday conversation. But when you think about these adjectives, actually these adjectives when we are talking about someone is kind, it means that that person, compared to other people, he is relatively more kind, which means that other people are not that kind, but he is kind. When you are saying she's generous, it means that other people, they are not generous, but compared to other people, she is generous. So actually, we are talking about individual differences where we are using these adjectives. Okay? So in a way, we are personality psychologists, but the difference from us and those formal trained psychologists is, those formal trained psychologists, whatever theories they are talking about, they have to be based on evidence. But for us, probably we don't have evidence, but we are always judging other people. We are always talking about individual differences. And these individual differences, where do they come from? Why are we different? Why are some people more generous than others? Why are some people more generous than others? Why are some people they are more stingy than others? Okay. Where do these individual differences come from? Okay. For psychology, if you still remember what psychologists do, we look at human behavior and we try to look for the causes of those behavior. But for personality, those individual differences, where do they come from? Probably the issue of why is relatively more complex. So before we know why, let's start with how we are different. Okay, so let's talk about the trait personality theories. There is a group of psychologists. They are not that really interested in knowing why we are different, but they want to know how we are different. So they assume that each of us has many different traits. Okay? And what are traits? They are qualities that individual has across situation. For example, honesty is a trait. Some people, they are more honest. Some people, probably they are not that honest. Some people, they are more generous. Some people, they are more kind. So like kind, generous, stingy, or honest. These are all traits. Okay? So how many traits do we have? Some people, they are more generous. Some people, they are stingy. Some people, they are good. Some people, they are kind. Some people, they are evil. These are all adjectives, and these are all human traits. How many kinds of traits do we have? Okay. Probably you can find these questions by how many adjectives we use to describe others. So how do we know how many traits we have in our human population? Okay. Does anyone have any idea? If you want to know how many traits we have in the human population, what could we do? Like generous is a trait. Honest is a trait. Generous and stingy is a trait. And how many traits do we have in the human population? And is there any way that we can know how many traits we have? Does anyone have any idea? A hint, those traits are adjectives. So if you want to know how many traits we have, a possibility is you can just try to find how many adjectives we have. And where could we find how many adjectives we have? Actually, there is a much simple way we can find how many traits we have in our human population. Yes? Yeah, adjectives.
Just looking at the dictionary, how many adjectives?
Yeah, just a relatively simple way, just look it up in the dictionary. So this is what they did back in 1936. But basically, these kind of research, they started from kind of English-speaking countries. So this study, Allport and Otbert, they just look up the dictionary, and they found there were roughly 18,000 of English adjectives. These adjectives are English-speaking people they use to describe others. So probably we can find traits from these adjectives. Okay. But 18,000 adjectives probably is a little bit too much. And some adjectives like good and nice, probably you wouldn't consider them different, because when you are talking about someone kind or someone nice, kind and nice, probably you are talking about the same thing. So although there are many adjectives, but some of them are synonyms. Synonyms means that two words sharing the same meaning, 同义字哦. So they boil it down, they just simplified the original 18,000 English adjectives. They made it into 200 synonym clusters, like kind and nice probably would be considered the same. But among these 200 synonyms, there are some adjectives. They are different, but they are similar, like kind and cruel. Although they are different, and if you look it up in the dictionary, basically they are not synonyms, they are antonyms, they are totally opposite. But they are referring to the same trait. Okay. Or generous and stingy. 大方跟小气, generous and stingy, they are different adjectives, but they all refer to the same concept. They refer to how willingness, like how willingness a person is willing to share his stuff. So basically, they are referring to the same thing. So although there were originally 200 synonym clusters, but you can make these 200 words into different poles. Poles are something like probably kind and cruel. They are different, but they refer to the same dimension. So every one of us, if I want you to judge how kind you are or how cruel you are, probably if I give you 1 to 5, you would judge, okay, I am 4 on the dimension of kindness. They all refer to kindness. Cruel means low kindness, and kind means high kindness. Or generous. And stingy. They are different adjectives, but they refer to the same concept. Or generosity. Generous means you are high in generosity, but stingy means you are low in generosity. Okay, and so on and so forth. So probably if I want you to judge how generous you are, you will also give yourself 4. So although there are 200 synonyms, but you can simplify them into different dimensions. Okay. And the next thing they did for these researchers, like this group of researchers, they then recruited a group of people. Okay. they asked a group of people, a large number of people, to ask them to rate themselves. So you got subject 1, subject 2, okay. Subject 1 probably, sorry. This is subject 1, and you've got subject 2 and subject 3, and so on and so forth. So subject 1 gives 4, and cruel, kind, stingy, generous. Probably there will be another dimension. Extroverted, 外向. Introverted. And probably subject 1 would rate himself 2 in the dimension, on the dimension of extroversion. Okay, so subject 1 will give you a vector, and subject 2 probably will give you another vector, like 2, 1, 1, and subject 3 give you another vector, 5, 3, 2, and then you recruit a large number of subject, probably 100. So you get 100 vectors. And then you just do some calculation. And according to their result, according to their statistical result, they found, although there are many dimensions, many poles, but some of them are highly correlated. For example, probably a person who is kind, he or she is more likely to be generous. So probably kind and generous, although there are 2 dimensions, but you can group them into one factor. So we call it factor. Okay. With this method, they found, although originally there were 200 synonyms, but basically these 200 synonyms, there are high correlation among some of them. So eventually you can find 5 factors, and these 5 factors are these 5. Extroversion, okay, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. Extroversion is an independent factor, which means that this is a very consistent, stable trait. Some people, they are more extroverted, and some people, they are more introverted. And agreeableness is another dimension. Extroversion and agreeableness, they are separate dimensions, which means a person could be extroverted and agreeable. Agreeable means that if you look at the word agree, when you agree on something, when you agree with some people, it means that how likely you will agree with other people or opinions. Are you kind of, in a more colloquial term, probably it means that are you an easy person or you are not very easy to get along with. This is agreeableness. So some people, they could be very extroverted and agreeable, or extroverted, unagreeable, or introverted, agreeable, or introverted, unagreeable. So with the 2 dimensions, there you could find 4 different kinds of people. Okay, and there is another dimension, another factor, conscientiousness. Conscientious. When we are using this word conscientious, it sounds like some people, they are more like conscientious people, they are nice people, and unconscientious people, they are evil people, but probably it's not that extreme. Here, the conscientiousness refers to how organized you are. Are you an organized person, or are you a responsible person? Are you a punctual person? If I ask you to do something, could you complete your task in time? This kind of trait is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness, according to their statistical result, could be separate from extroversion and agreeableness, which means that a person could be very extroverted, very agreeable, and very conscientious. Or a person could be extroverted, agreeable, but not conscientious. Or a person could be introverted, agreeable, conscientiousness, or introverted, unagreeable, unconscientiousness. With these 3 dimensions, 3 factors, basically you can find 8, 2 by 2 by 2, 8 different kinds of people. Okay. But this is not everything. This is not the whole picture. This trait, neuroticism, also is a separate trait. If a person is very neurotic, it means that this person is emotionally unstable. This person gets nervous easily. Okay? If a person is not neurotic, it means that this person is more calm. This person doesn't get anxious easily. And neuroticism is also a separate dimension from the first three. Usually we have a stereotype that an introverted person probably is more neurotic. Probably an introverted person probably gets nervous more easily. An extroverted person probably doesn't get nervous easily. So we have this kind of stereotype that neuroticism is correlated with extroversion, but according to their result, statistical result, these two are separate dimensions. Okay? How extroverted you are is irrelevant with how neurotic you are. Okay? And there's another separate dimension, openness to experience. It means that how likely you are open to new things, new experiences, new people. Okay? Are you kind of tolerant person or not? And this trait is also separate from the rest of the four. We tend to have a stereotype that probably an extroverted person is more open to new experiences, and an introverted person probably is more reluctant to new experiences. But according to their statistical result, how extroverted you are is irrelevant with how likely you are willing to accept new experiences. Okay, so with the 5 dimension, you can find 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, 2 to the power of 5, 32 kinds of people. Okay, this is basically, if we review how they form these 5 different factors, they started from English adjectives in dictionary, and then they just group some of them into, because some of them are synonyms, so eventually, although originally there were 18,000 adjectives, but you can simplify it to 200 synonyms, and then they form poles, like cruel and kind, they are on the same pole. On the same dimension, but 2 poles. Stingy and generous, they are on the same dimension, but on 2 poles. And then they just asked a group of people to rate themselves, and they found some of them have high correlations. So for those highly correlated dimensions, they just grouped them into one factor. So eventually they found these 5 factors. Okay? And one strategy to memorize these 5 factors is if you look at the initials of these 5 words, okay, you can form an English word, O-C-E-A, and ocean. Okay. So the ocean means these 5 factors. Okay. So this is 5-factor model. Okay. But probably some people might be skeptical by their methodology because they began from English dictionaries. And probably people will be skeptical about how could you generalize your results to other cultures. Probably this 5-factor model, it doesn't apply to probably here, Chinese-speaking areas. So yes, and there were some follow-up studies, and they also used the same method, but on other cultures, and they found that it's quite consistent across different cultures. This result it has been replicated in 56 different nations, so probably it's cross-cultural. Okay. When you find something cross-cultural, the next thing you will think about is, if it is cross-cultural, which means that it's not affected by the culture, could we find physiological basis? Could we find any brain structures that are related to things like extroversion? Okay. To find physiological evidence it's relatively harder for this kind of topic. Probably it will be easier for other topics like perception, memory, cognition, things like those. But for personality, a person's personality is affected by many potentially factors. So probably it's harder to find the physiological basis. But some people, they did try to do it, and they found some interesting results. For example, extroversion. Extroversion is one of the factors in this 5-factor model. And according to this study, they showed people faces, and they also asked these people to lie in the functional MRI machine. Okay. And when those people, they were presented with fearful faces, usually, because when you find a fearful face, usually it signals something dangerous. So fearful faces, probably, no matter how extroverted you are, all of us are very sensitive to fearful faces. So as long as you see a fearful faces, your brain is very active regardless how extroverted you are. So they found no correlation between extroversion and your brain activity. Because no matter how extroverted you are, you will be always sensitive to fearful faces. Your brain is always sensitive to fearful faces. So you can't find a correlation between your brain activity and how extroverted you are. But for happy faces, they found a correlation. If you are an extroverted person, 外向性的哈, you are more sensitive. Your brain is more sensitive to happy faces. So your brain activity is more active when you are looking at a happy face. But if you are a relatively introverted person, 内向的哈, your brain is not that sensitive to happy faces. So your brain activity is less active when you are looking at a happy face. So they found a correlation between your brain activity and how extroverted you are. So in a way, although it doesn't sound very direct, but in a way they found, yes, there is some kind of physiological evidence for the trait of extroversion. Okay. But what I just said, for personality, it's relatively complex. So this kind of research is more preliminary. Okay, we still don't have a very solid or established evidence about how our brain related to personality. So this is trait theory. Okay. Actually, if you look at this word trait, personality theories, this is plural, which means that there is more than one theory. Okay. But the common thing about these kind of theory is they all assume that we have very consistent traits. If you are a generous person, you will be generous all the time. If you are an extroverted person, you will be extroverted all the time. It is not affected by the situation. They have this kind of assumption. Okay. And they try to look for those traits from these statistical analysis. Okay. But the thing they got criticized is some people, they argue that, are you sure that we have very consistent traits? Because if you look at the human behavior, some people, they might claim they are extroverted, but if you really look at their behavior, they behave extroverted in some situation, but they don't look that extroverted in other situation. How do you explain this kind of inconsistency? Okay. This is called consistency paradox. If you ask people to judge themselves, the judging results are consistent. If they think themselves as an extroverted person, it will always be extroverted. This is consistent. But if you really look at their behavior, a person could look like an extroverted person in some situation, but the same person could also look introverted in other situations. So there is an inconsistency here, and this is called consistency paradox. And this is how and why those trait theorists, they got criticized. because you claim that we have stable traits, but are you sure we do have stable traits, or actually our behavior is actually affected by the environment? And to defend their theories, these trait theorists, they claim that yes, if you look at human behavior from a superficial level, they look different, but deep inside, they still have a very consistent trait. For example, a person might behave differently in different parties. The same person, for party that this person, she needs to disclose. Disclose means that she has to reveal about her private things. Okay. For parties or for social gatherings that she has to disclose herself, she will look unfriendly. But in other situations where she doesn't have to disclose herself, she looks friendly. Okay. And it depends on the psychological feature of this situation. So according to their defense, we still have trait. We have trait. And it is consistent across different situations. But we also have different behavior. Okay. Behavior is not that consistent according to different situations. The relationship between the two is mediated by psychological features of this situation. So, the same person should be friendly. The same person, a person could be friendly. And friendliness is a consistent trait. But if you look at behavior, it could be friendly or unfriendly. That is mediated by the psychological feature of the situation. So this psychological feature, according to this example, whether you need to disclose, is a very important psychological feature. Okay? You are a friendly person, and this is consistent. If you have to disclose yourself, and then you will behave unfriendly. But the reason why you behave unfriendly, it doesn't mean that you don't have the trait of friendliness. You still have this trait. But in some situations, this trait is somehow blocked by the psychological feature. So although from a superficial level, the same person behaves differently in different situations, but it doesn't mean that they don't have a consistent trait. The trait still exists, but maybe it is blocked by the psychological feature of the situation. This is how they defend for their theory. But anyway, what they want to claim is, according to these personality theorists, what they want to claim is our traits are consistent across different situations. Okay. Okay, so to evaluate this theory, the criticism they got is they don't explain how personality develops. Some people, they are more extroverted. Some other people, they are introverted. They don't talk about why. They just describe the phenomenon. He is extroverted. She is introverted, and that's it. No one cares about why he is extroverted and she is introverted. Okay. And the second criticism they have been, for them is, their view for the personality is static. Basically, they don't think people will change. If you are an extroverted person, you will always be extroverted. If you are an agreeable person, probably you will be always agreeable. Okay? So this is trait personality theories. Next, psychodynamic theories. If you look at the word, it is also plural, which means there are more than two theories in psychodynamic theories. But we are going to talk about only one of them, which is Freudian psychoanalysis. The Freudian here means this theory was originally developed by Sigmund Freud, okay, a very famous psychologist in the last century. And probably before you took this course, probably you have ever heard of this name, Sigmund Freud. And probably this is also non-psychologists think psychologists are. When people are thinking about what psychologists are doing, this is the stereotype they are thinking about. They are thinking about a person, a therapist, is sitting in a room and try to analyze his patient's behavior, okay? And this patient is lying on the couch, and they try to talk about their childhood experiences. This is a very typical stereotype that people, non-psychology people, have about psychologists. This stereotype actually comes from psychoanalysis, because that kind of scenario is what psychoanalysts do in their therapeutic sessions. Okay. For them, for Freudian psychoanalysis, a very important feature is, for them, all behavior is motivated. No chance causes behavior. What does it mean? It means that, like when you're walking on the street and you see two convenience stores, like in Taiwan, 7-Eleven and Family Mart, and probably you choose to go to 7-Eleven instead of Family Mart. And probably if I ask you why did you choose 7-Eleven instead of Family Mart? Probably you would tell me that because it was just, it doesn't have any reason. I just happened to see 7-Eleven first, so I just walked into 7-Eleven. It's just by chance. It doesn't imply anything. But for psychoanalysis, for them, there is no chance. The reason why you do a particular action, the reason why you do a particular behavior, it must have some reason. The reason why you chose 7-Eleven instead of Family Mart, it is not random. It must have some reasons. Okay? And that reason probably is related to your childhood experiences. Okay? Because for them, there's no random behavior. Every behavior, each word you say every day, it all implies something deep in your mind. So if I want to know what's in your mind, one of the possibilities is I try to analyze your every single action and every single word you say. So that is also why this kind of school is called psychoanalysis, because what they do is to analyze other people's every single behavior and every single word they say, trying to know what is happening in their mind. Okay. And why did you choose 7-Eleven instead of Family Mart? There could be many reasons, and one of the major reasons is because you have some basic drives in your mind. These basic drives, according to psychoanalysis, there is self-preservation. One of the two basic drives is self-preservation. Self-preservation is when you feel hungry, you will try to find food to eat. When you feel thirsty, you will try to get water to drink, because you are a biological entity. So you need nutrition. You need water. So this is your basic drive, and there's no doubt that every one of us is pursuing this kind of drive. But living in a society like Taiwan, like in a civilized society, probably we don't have to worry about hunger or thirst. So probably this kind of drive, they are not manifested. We can't observe them, because if you want to find the function of this kind of drive, you have to find a situation where people don't have enough food or water, and then you can find the effect of the lack of those drive. But because in our civilized society, probably no one of us has to worry about hunger or thirst. So probably this kind of drive, it doesn't play a very important role in our life. If it doesn't play an important role in our life, the other drive becomes more important. This drive, according to psychoanalysis, they called it eros. But the eros, the translation of eros is sexual desire, but the sexual desire here doesn't mean the sexual desire we use nowadays. This sexual desire, the eros used in psychoanalysis, includes sexual union. Sexual union means the desire to have sex with other people, which is the sexual desire we think about in nowadays. And this is just part of the sexual desire. Sexual desire, or eros, includes something more than that. It also includes the desire to seek pleasure or to make physical contact with others. These others here could be people or could be objects. But anyway, we all have some kind of desire to touch other things. This is also part of the eros in psychoanalysis. And because we all have the urge to touch other things, but where in our body is more sensitive to that kind of touch, it changes according to your age. When you were just a baby, according to a psychoanalysis, the major pleasure zone of our body is our mouth. We all seek contact with other things with our mouths. So that's why in psychoanalysis they call it oral stage, because in this stage you have the desire to touch other things, anything with your mouth. Okay, oral stage. And probably it's not hard to understand, because you can imagine a baby of this age, they have to rely on other people feeding them. So whatever close to their mouth, they have to touch it. That is how they get nutrition from. Okay. But after this stage, when we get a little bit older, like 2 to 3 years old, the part of your body that wants to contact other things change. At this stage, it becomes anal, your anus. Here, erogenous zones. The erogenous zone, the word erogenous here, it doesn't really mean the erogenous. Probably has a different connotation from that we use nowadays. The erogenous zones used in psychoanalysis, it means that the area in your body that you want to use to contact other things. And for baby around 2 to 3 years old, because that is the stage their parents trying to train them to probably use toilet. So their attention at this stage is on their anus. Okay. So that's why they call it anal stage. Okay. And then when you reach 4 or 5 years old, particularly for boys, probably not that much for girls, they started to get interested in their own genitals. And according to psychoanalysis, this stage, they call it phallic stage, around 4 or 5 years old. Children, particularly for boys, at this stage, the most sensitive area of their body is their genitals. They want to use their genitals to touch other things. Okay. And then when they hit like school age, like 6 years old, up to 12 years old, before puberty, at this stage, it doesn't look like there is any particular on their body they want to use to contact other things. So that's why in Freudian psychoanalysis, they call it latency, because you can't really find any significant area in their body that they want to use to contact other people or things. Okay? And then when they hit puberty, like 13 years old, this is the genital stage. This is a little bit confusing. Although this is called genital stage, but the erogenous zones, of course genitals is also part of the erogenous zone, but it is not everything. In addition to touching other people with their genitals, they also want to develop like normal, mature relationship with other people. Okay? Basically, this stage is mature adult. Okay? So each stage, they all have a specific area in their body they want to use to touch other things. If this kind of desire the desire to touch other things is not fulfilled, then you will get problems. Okay. The problem is fixation. Fixation is if in any of the stages you got too much gratification, you're stimulated too much up to a point you don't want to move on, you want to stay in that stage. Or if you get too much frustration, you are not stimulated enough, so you are still seeking stimulation even when you are getting older. Then you would have the problem of fixation. And if you have the fixation problem, then these kind of fixation problem could be transformed into some kind of psychological disorder. For example, you might have heard of some people saying that obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, 强迫症, probably some psychoanalysts, they claim that the reason why you got OCD is you are fixated at the anal stage. Okay? But it is just one of the hypotheses that psychoanalysts they use to describe OCD. Another feature for psychoanalysis is according to this table you see here, childhood experience is very important. If you have any problem during your childhood, these problems will become psychological disorders when you become an adult. So for them, childhood experiences are very important, and this is called psychic determinism. Okay? All mental and behavioral reactions are determined by early experiences. So if you have an abnormal childhood, and you are very likely to get any kind of psychological disorder. The other way to talk about this is if you have any psychological disorder, it is very, very, very likely that those problems, they arise from your childhood. So if I want to fix your problem, then I have to know what is going on, what happened when you were a child. Okay? And this is called psychic determinism. But sometimes people might be wondering, if you have some psychological issue and you go to see a doctor, you go to see a psychiatrist or psychologist, and they tell you that there must be some problem with your childhood, and probably you'll be wondering, but I had a very, very fulfilling childhood. I had a very happy childhood. How come my childhood had any problem? And that therapist will probably tell you that the reason why you can't recall your childhood experiences is because they don't exist. It is because they exist and they happen, but you just suppress them into your unconsciousness or subconsciousness. Okay? The thing that you can recall, you can remember, you can report, they are in your consciousness. Okay? But consciousness is just a very, very small portion of your mind. A much bigger portion of your mind is your subconsciousness. Subconsciousness has those memories, those images, those experiences that happens to you, but you just don't remember them. But they do exist, and they somehow affect your behavior. They somehow cause your psychological disorders, but you just can't remember them. If you can't remember them, then how can I fix your problem? So that's why in some therapists, the therapist will use some techniques like hypnosis, 催眠. Hypnosis is one of the techniques they use to try to analyze your subconsciousness. Okay? Because you can't recall, and so that's why I have to use some kind of strategy like hypnosis to get access to your subconsciousness. Okay? And the relationship between consciousness and subconsciousness is just like this iceberg. When you see an iceberg, the part you see is probably just one small corner of the whole iceberg. There is a much, much bigger part that you can't really see, just like your mind. The things, the part you can recall, the part you can report, the part you can remember, it is just a small portion of your mind. But there is another much bigger portion in your mind that you can't remember, but they still affect your behavior. Although those things are in your subconsciousness, but those unconscious or subconscious impulse within this subconscious level, they will affect your behavior. Okay? For example, like this Freudian slip. Freudian slip is sometimes when you want to say some things, but you make mistake. But according to what I just said, for psychoanalysis, there's no random behavior. Every behavior has a reason. The reason why you make a speech error, it's not random. There must be something in your mind. There must be something in your subconsciousness that makes you to make this mistake. This is just an example the author of the textbook gives. Because the author of your textbook, there was one time he went to visit an old friend and he stayed with his friend for about 1 week. Actually, he didn't enjoy the trip, but at the end of the trip, he wanted to be polite. So he was meant to say, "I'm glad we got to spend a chunk of time together." That is the thing that he wanted to say to his friends because he wants to thank his friend for hosting him for 1 week. But unfortunately, this is what he actually said. "I'm glad we got to spend a chunk of time together." This chunk of time, junk means that rubbish or trash. I'm glad that we spent a rubbish of time together, and it's actually quite rude. It's not a very polite behavior. But why did he make this kind of mistake? Probably according to psychoanalysis, this kind of mistake is not random. It somehow implies somewhere in your mind, actually you didn't enjoy the trip. So that's why you make this kind of mistake. And this kind of mistake is not controlled by your consciousness. It's from your subconsciousness. Okay. So although there is a big part in our mind that we are not conscious of, so they are in our subconsciousness, but they are still there. And sometimes they will just come into your consciousness or affect your behavior out of sudden, like without your permission. Sometime, like in this example, sometime they will affect your behavior. According to Freud, our human mind is just like iceberg, and the part you can see is above the ocean of the iceberg. It's just a small portion of the iceberg, just like your mind. The part you could be conscious of is just a small portion of your mind. There is a much more portion in your mind that you are not conscious of at all. But those unconscious mind, it affects your behavior actually much more than your conscious mind. And this is how Freud defined self. When we are talking about self, like in our everyday language, when you are talking about I or me, we have an illusion that me or I refers to one single thing. But according to psychoanalysis, there are actually 3 different things in the concept of me or I. It includes it, superego, and ego. 我们在中文里面我们翻本我、超我跟自我。It is the primitive me or the primitive self. It is irrational and it is acting on impulse. Okay? It does whatever it wants. Basically, it is based on pleasure principle. Whatever makes you happy, you do it. That is what it does. But of course, we can't act like our it because we're living in the civilized society. So we have to obey the moral codes. So that's why we need a superego. It's just like an angel, or it's like a guardian angel that kind of monitors our every behavior. Okay. It is the storehouse for moral attitudes. So you're hungry, there is a piece of bread on the table, you want to eat it, but you know you can't eat it because it's not yours. And you need money, and you find some cash on the table and you want to take it, but you know that you can't take it, otherwise it will be a stealing. And you know these moral codes, it affects your behavior, and it is your superego. It governs your behavior also a lot. So in most of the cases, in most of the situations, the it is trying to ask you to do things that the superego doesn't want you to do. So they are always in fight. They are always in conflict. So what should you do? That's why you need a third self, which is ego. Ego is the part of self that reality-based, and it arbitrates the conflict between it and superego. There is always conflict between it and superego, and the ego is the mediator. Okay, ego is the guy who makes the final decision. There's a piece of bread on the table. The it wants me to eat it. The superego doesn't want me to eat it. And what should I do? Ego has to make a decision. So each of us has the three different selves according to psychoanalysis. And your ego is really very busy because your it and your superego, they are always in fight. So your ego is always busy trying to arbitrate their fight. So that's why sometimes ego has to use some strategies to resolve the conflict between your it and your superego. And those strategies, according to psychoanalysis, they call them ego defense mechanisms. There are many different kinds of ego defense mechanisms. If you type ego defense mechanism on Google, probably you can find more than 20 kinds of ego defense mechanisms. But we're only talking about 3 of them. Okay? Basically, they are strategies that ego uses to defend itself in the daily conflict between it and superego. One of them is called repression. Repression is because your it always wants you to do things that the society is not accepting. So in order to calm your it down, sometimes you are suppressing or you are repressing your unaccepted desires into your subconsciousness. Okay? You just deny they don't exist. You have those desires, but they are not accepted by the society, so you just repress them to your subconsciousness, and you kind of pretend that they don't exist. This kind of strategy is called repression. Or reaction formation. You have some desires that are not accepted by the society, so you cope with this kind of desire by doing something totally opposite. For example, probably you are homosexual, you are attracted to people of the same sex, but probably it is not accepted in your society. So you cope with these desires by doing something opposite to homosexuality. You are acting very homophobic. You pretend that you hate or you detest homosexuals to kind of hide your homosexuality. Okay? And this is one of the strategies that you are potentially using. This kind of strategy is called reaction formation. You are doing something totally opposite, trying to repress those unaccepted desires. Or this sublimation. Sublimation is you have some desires. You know, in psychoanalysis, they talk about desires a lot, particularly sexual desires. If your sexual desires are not accepted by the society, one of the strategies you can possibly use is to do something different, but similar, in order to release this kind of tension. Probably you have heard of some stories like a very famous writer. He wrote a masterpiece, and if you try to investigate his situation at that time, probably you'll find that probably at that time of his life, he had some kind of desires, and those kind of desires was not accepted by the society. So in order to relieve the tension coming from those desires, he wrote a very important art piece. And in order to kind of, from his work, you can see the trace of those desires, but it's not too obvious. Okay? In that case, you have some desires, but you just trying to fulfill your desire by doing something similar to your desire, but not exactly the same as your desire. Trying to do something that is accepted by the society. in order to substitute your original desires. And this process, this strategy is called sublimation. Okay. There are more than 3 self-defense mechanisms, but I'm just talking about 3 of them. If you're really interested, you can just simply Google it. You can find more than 20 kind of self-defense mechanisms in psychoanalysis. Okay. But sometimes if you use too much self-defense mechanisms, it could be harmful. Particularly, it could be harmful to your psychological well-being. For example, some people, they have anxiety problem. According to psychoanalysis, the reason of anxiety could be because you have those unaccepted desires and you repress them. Okay? And you use too much repression. And so there is too much information in your subconsciousness. Up to a point, those information, those contents in your subconsciousness, they will try to seek opportunities to leak out of your subconsciousness. And when you find that they are almost leaking out, you feel anxious. Probably that is why you have anxiety problem. Okay? This is just one example. It doesn't mean that anxiety is caused by subconsciousness. It's just an example that if you are going to see a doctor, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist, and if that psychiatrist or psychologist is trained by psychoanalysis, probably this could be a potential diagnosis your therapist will use. Why do you feel conscious? Why do you feel anxious? It's just because of those information in your subconsciousness. Okay, it's just one possibility. Okay, so that was psychoanalysis. And actually in psychology, if you go to most of the psychology departments around the world, most of the psychologists nowadays, their attitudes towards psychoanalysis is biased to be negative. Okay? Most of the psychologists nowadays, basically they don't have very high opinion about psychoanalysis. The reason is, according to our first lecture, psychology nowadays, we treat psychology as a science. It is not we are not sure whether it's the best way to study the human mind, but it is the method we use nowadays. We try to study the human mind with scientific methods. So whatever theories you propose, you need evidence. For psychoanalysis, it's really hard to get evidence. For example, the 5 stages, the anal stage, the oral stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, the genital stage, how could you design an experiment to test those stages? Okay. Or superego, ego, how do you design an experiment to test the 3 different selves? They are theories and they might be right, but they are not testable. If it is not testable, and it will not be regarded as a science. And if it is not a science, probably it's not that accepted nowadays in psychology. So if you want to know more about psychoanalysis, probably it will be hard for you to find any relevant courses in any of the psychology departments in major universities around the world. Probably it will be easier for you to find a course in places like literature, because as far as I know, that psychoanalysis, it does play a very important role on literature. Okay, so like in Taiwan, if you want to take psychoanalysis course, probably the best place you should go is like Department of Foreign Languages or Literature. These kind of places, you can more easily to find things about psychoanalysis. In psychology itself, it is one theory of many kinds of psychological theories, but basically, more like most people, their attitudes towards psychoanalysis, they're slightly more negative. Okay. It's vague. The concepts are not operationally defined and cannot be disproved, or it can't be used to predict. It only can be used retrospectively. For example, if someone has OCD problem, obsessive compulsive disorder, 强迫症, and probably the psychoanalyst will tell you that you are fixated on the anal stage. Okay, but it's really very retrospectively, because probably many people, they are fixated at their anal stage, but how come other people, they don't develop OCD? How come I develop OCD? So you can't really predict anything. Okay? You can only explain things after that thing has happened. Although it's a developmental theory, the reason why it's a developmental theory is because they talk a lot about childhood experiences, but they don't really include observation of children, and it is male-centered. Okay. But they do accept positive opinions. Much of our day-to-day experience shaped by unconscious processes. Most of the psychologists nowadays, we do agree that there is a bigger portion of your mind that you are not conscious of, but your unconscious mind affects your behavior a lot. So that was psychoanalysis.